Okay, so we've talked about polygons, and we know that polygons are closed shapes. Okay, they're plane shapes, so they're flat, and they have angles, and they have line segments that come together and form points. We've talked about that. So now we're going to talk about the different types of lines in a polygon. So if we look, we have intersecting lines. These intersecting lines cross or meet and they form angles. So we can see right here we have two lines. We know they're lines because they have those arrows on both sides, so they go on and on forever in those both directions. And they meet together right here at this point. So when two lines either cross each other or come together and meet like this, then those are called intersecting lines. So if we look at this polygon shape over here, we can see that the orange line and the blue line, so the orange and blue lines here, they come together at this point. Okay, so the orange and blue line segments meet and form an angle, so they are intersecting lines. Okay, so that's what happens when two line segments come together. And notice that if they continued on, if this one continued on and this one continued on, so if I continued these lines, see if I can continue this one on, and then I continued this line and kept going with this line, they would cross each other. So when lines continue on and they cross each other, they are called intersecting lines. Okay, so let's go on to our next page. And here we're going to look, let me just get back to my arrow. Right here we can see that there is a type of intersecting line that meets at a right angle. Remember that right angle is when we can make a square. If we draw lines going up and over, we make that perfect square right there. Those intersecting lines that form a right angle, those are called perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines. So we can see over here in our shape, same shape, but looking at that orange and blue line, those were intersecting lines. The red and blue lines together, those are also intersecting lines, but if we see right here, we form that right angle. So if we form that right angle, then they are intersecting lines, but they're also called perpendicular lines because they form that right angle. So we have intersecting lines, which means they cross each other at some point. They'll hit that point where they cross each other. They meet together. Orange and blue lines meet together, but the red and blue lines form that right angle. So those are also perpendicular lines. On to our next page. All right, so let's take a look. We're going to draw a polygon with one pair of parallel sides. Then we're going to draw a polygon with two pairs of parallel lines. Hold on. Let's go back to the screen because we forgot to talk about what parallel lines are. So hold on. Let's get this back up here. Okay, we had our perpendicular lines and I forgot to move down. So before we move on, we need to talk about our parallel lines. Okay, so our beginning question was how many pairs of sides are parallel in that shape that we were just talking about. Okay, so we talked about lines that were intersecting. Those are not parallel. We talked about lines that were perpendicular, also not parallel. Lines that appear to never cross or meet and are always the same distance apart, those are parallel lines. They do not form any angles. So if we look at our shape, we can see that the green line and the blue line, no matter where we are between those two lines, there's always the same distance. And if I kept drawing, so let me get my lines back up here. If I kept drawing the blue line on and on and on and never stopped, and I kept drawing that green line on and on and on and it never stopped, they would never ever touch. See how this one goes on and on forever this way? Goes on and on forever this way, and there's always the same amount of space in between them. They're never ever going to touch. So lines that are never going to touch like that are going across opposite ends of each other, those are parallel lines. So let me move down here. So we can see that the green and blue lines, if we kept drawing on and on, would never ever touch. So those, they're never going to meet, those are parallel lines. Lines that never meet are parallel lines. So now we can move on to the next page. And on this page, we're going to draw one polygon that has one pair of parallel lines. So we just learned that parallel lines are lines that have the same distance apart. So if I draw these two lines to be parallel, notice they have 2 blocks in between them every time. There's always going to be 2 blocks in between them. They're never ever going to touch. So we have one pair of parallel lines here. But if we only have one pair, then the other lines, let me change my color here. The other lines cannot be parallel. So I kind of drew this one at an angle. Okay, so you can see that one's at an angle. And then this one is straight. So if you look at these lines, okay, right here we have 1, 2, 3, and then this little piece here. And then up here we have 1, 2, 3, and a smaller piece. So it's not the same space in between these two lines. This one has more squares, and this one has less squares. So those are not parallel because there's not the same number of squares between them. And if I continue to draw this one this way, oh, actually, let me go up this way. If I continue to draw it up this way, and then I continue to draw this one this way, I'm going a straight line here, eventually these lines are going to meet up together. You can see right about there. They meet up together at this point. Okay, so those are not parallel. So if we look at this shape, let me go back to where I was. Okay, this has only one set of parallel lines. So that was the first thing we had to do, one pair of parallel sides. So this has one set where there's always 2 squares in between them. If I continued this line on, there would still only be 2 squares in between them. But this side has different amounts in between them. So they are not parallel. And eventually they're going to meet together, which we saw. The second part says we then have to draw a polygon that has 2 pairs of parallel sides. So let me go back and actually I'll leave it black here. So we'll go, here's one set of parallel lines. Okay, I'm going to make them 3 squares apart. Okay, so there's always going to be 3 squares in between these. They'll go on and on forever, never touch, so those are parallel. We need to do another set of parallel. I'm going to turn on blue. Let's do blue. If I draw this one, connect it there, draw this one and connect it here, I can see between the blue lines there's always 3 squares. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And if I continued on, and I continued on with this one, there would always be 3 squares between them and they would never meet. So this polygon right here has 2 sets of parallel lines, the black set and the blue set. This one only had one set of parallel lines, the red set. The black set will eventually meet each other, and they do not have the same amount of squares in between them. Okay, so remember, parallel lines always have the same amount of space in between them, and they'll never ever meet if we continue drawing them. Okay, so looking at this shape here, C and A are parallel, and B and D are parallel. Now let's take a look at some shapes here. Click back on my arrow. Looking at these shapes here, I want you to look at the green sides of these polygons. Okay, look at the green sides of these polygons. Do those green sides look like they're intersecting, perpendicular, or parallel? We already have some of these answers here. So if we look at this one, we can see that if we keep drawing, they meet together at this point. So those are intersecting lines. Okay, this line and this line meet together, so they're intersecting. If we look over here at this shape, we can see that, let me get my line up here, where they meet together, that little point that they meet together forms that right angle. So those are perpendicular lines. But we also know that they're going to be crossing each other at this point. Okay, they meet together at this point, which means they're intersecting as well. Okay, so these two lines are intersecting, but not perpendicular because they do not form that square when they meet together. These two are intersecting, but they're also perpendicular because of that right angle. Okay, so our three different types of lines: parallel, intersecting, and perpendicular. These lines right up here, C and A, B and D, C and A are parallel, B and D are parallel. These lines are perpendicular and intersecting, and these lines are intersecting. Okay, nice job. Go ahead and do lesson 12.4 on Think Central.